There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a simple question asked in a low voice that carries none of its own weight, but somehow absorbs the weight of everything you have ever felt. It becomes a fulcrum, a point on which the entire architecture of your world pivots, so subtly at first that you do not even realize the foundations have shifted. You only know that the light is falling differently through the windows, and the air in the familiar rooms now holds a new and unknown resonance. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic event. It was a question offered into the quiet, humming darkness of a car at 2 in the morning, a space that had always been ours, a capsule of comfortable silence moving through a sleeping city. It was the sound of his voice, frayed with an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle or bone. When he turned to me from the passenger seat, the fractured glow of streetlights painting fleeting stripes across his face. He said he didn't want to ride home alone, and that was not the moment, not quite. That was just the prelude, the familiar request after a long week. The moment itself came a few seconds later, a quiet amendment, an afterthought that was not an afterthought at all. He asked if we could take the long way, and in the space that followed that question, I felt it. The quiet, seismic shift. The long way home. It was not a question about geography. It was a question about time, about proximity, about delaying the inevitable moment when we would arrive at our apartment, go to our separate rooms, and the fragile, unspoken thing that existed between us in the shared spaces, the living room, the kitchen, this car, would once again dissolve behind closed doors. Taking the long way was a request to remain in the bubble, to suspend the rules of our carefully constructed friendship for just a little while longer. I did not answer immediately. I simply flicked the turn signal, my knuckles brushing the worn leather of the steering wheel, and guided the car away from the direct route, away from the highway that would deliver us efficiently back to our lives, and turned instead toward the winding coastal road, where the darkness was deeper, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic sweep of a lighthouse beam and the whisper of the unseen ocean. The silence in the car was no longer just comfortable. It was charged, a vessel holding a delicate and volatile substance, and I was terrified that a single wrong word, a single breath taken too sharply, would be enough to shatter it completely. To understand the weight of that simple request, you would have to understand the 5 years that preceded it. You would have to understand the architecture of our friendship, a structure I had helped build and whose blueprints I knew by heart, because I had spent so much of my time studying its every line, its every load-bearing wall, and its every hidden, sealed-off room. I met Alex our freshman year of college. We were both on the swim team, which in itself was a study in contrasts. He was a sprinter, all explosive power and raw, kinetic energy. His races were a violent burst of churning water and straining muscle that were over in less than a minute, leaving him gasping at the wall, adrenaline singing in his veins. I was a distance swimmer. My world was the quiet, meditative rhythm of the mile, the hypnotic black line on the bottom of the pool, the steady, metronomic count of strokes and breaths. My races were not about explosion. They were about endurance, about finding a pace and holding it for what felt like an eternity, about managing the slow, accumulating burn in my muscles and the ache in my lungs. He was the thunder, I was the tide. Our friendship formed in the spaces around the pool. In the locker room, filled with the scent of chlorine and steam, where he would laugh and sling insults with the other guys while I quietly packed my bag in the corner. On the long bus rides to away meets, where he would inevitably fall asleep with his head lolled against the vibrating window, and I would watch the landscape blur past, hyper-aware of his presence in the seat next to me. He was drawn to my quiet, I think, in the same way a moth is drawn to a porch light. He saw it as a place of calm, a respite from his own restless energy. He never seemed to demand that I be anything other than what I was. He would talk, and I would listen, and that seemed to be enough for him. For my part, I was drawn to his light. He had a way of moving through the world with an unthinking grace and confidence that I could only ever dream of. People orbited him naturally. He was warm and bright and loud, and standing near him felt like standing in the sun. My feelings for him were a slow-developing photograph, an image emerging gradually in the chemical bath of proximity and time. There was no single moment of revelation. It was 1,000 tiny things. It was the way he'd absent-mindedly run a hand through his damp hair after practice, scattering droplets of chlorinated water like tiny crystals in the fluorescent light. It was the specific timbre of his laugh when he was genuinely amused by something, a sound that started deep in his chest. It was the time he fell asleep on the couch in our first shared apartment after graduation, his arm dangling off the edge, his fingers brushing the floor, and I felt an almost painful urge to kneel down and take his hand in mine. I learned to live with this feeling, to wall it off inside myself. It was a private, secret garden I tended to in the quiet hours of the night. My photography became my outlet, my silent confession. I had countless images of him, captured in unguarded moments, sleeping on the couch, backlit by the afternoon sun, staring out the window at the rain, lost in thought, laughing with friends at a party, his face thrown back in pure joy. I told myself I was documenting our lives, our friendship. But I knew the truth. I was trying to capture the light he emitted, to hold on to it, to possess it in the only way I knew I ever could. He, of course, was oblivious. He moved through a world of women, a series of bright, beautiful girlfriends who would enter our lives for a few months, filling our apartment with the scent of different perfumes and the sound of unfamiliar laughter, before eventually fading away. I was the constant, the stable ground beneath his feet. I was the one who listened to him dissect the relationships, both in their hopeful beginnings and their messy ends. I was the friend, the roommate, the brother he never had. I played the part so well, so consistently, that I think I even managed to convince myself most of the time. The ache was a dull, constant companion, a low-grade fever I had learned to function with. It was the price of his proximity, and for years, I had paid it without question. Because the alternative, a life without his light, without the sound of his key in the lock at the end of the day, was simply unthinkable. His friendship was a house I lived in, and my love for him was a ghost in its walls, a presence I had learned to coexist with, silent and unseen. The shift began, as so many shifts do, with an ending. His relationship with Sarah was the longest he'd ever had, nearly 2 years. She was nice enough, an architect who was smart and funny and seemed to genuinely care for him. I thought, with a familiar, hollow pang in my chest, that this might be the one. I prepared myself for the inevitable conversation where he would tell me he was moving out, that they were getting a place together. I rehearsed my smile, my congratulations. But the conversation never came. Instead, one Tuesday evening, he came home early from work, his face pale and shuddered. He walked past me in the living room without a word, went into his bedroom, and closed the door. The sound of that click was louder than a gunshot in the quiet apartment. He did not emerge for hours. I made dinner, the sounds of my own movements seeming unnervingly loud. I ate alone at the small kitchen table, staring at the closed door to his room, a new and unwelcome boundary that had suddenly sprung up in the heart of our shared space. When he finally came out, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He walked to the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water, and stood there, leaning against the counter, not drinking it. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "Sarah and I. It's done." I did not know what to say. The part of me that was his friend felt a genuine surge of sympathy. The ghost in the walls, however, the secret, selfish part of me, felt a flicker of something terrible and sharp, a thing I refused to name. I crushed it down immediately, ashamed. I just nodded. "I'm sorry, man," I managed. "What happened?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. "I don't even know. Not really. She said I'm not really there. That I'm like a closed room she can't get into. That I keep everyone at arm's length. Even her." He finally looked at me, a desperate, confused expression on his face. "Am I like that, Jules? Am I a closed room?" The question hung in the air between us. I wanted to tell him that he was the most open, sunlit person I had ever known. But I also knew what she meant. There was a core to him, a central chamber, that he kept locked away. He offered the world his warmth, his energy, his laughter, but he rarely offered his vulnerability. He built his life on the surface, where the water was bright and easy to navigate, and seemed terrified of the depths. I was perhaps the only person who had ever caught glimpses of what lay beneath, in the quiet, unguarded moments. But they were just that, glimpses. "No," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're not." That night was the beginning of the change. The breakup did not just make him sad, it seemed to unmoor him. The usual bright energy that surrounded him dissipated, leaving behind a stillness that was unsettling. He stopped going out. He'd come home from his job as a software consultant, his shoulders slumped, and just collapse onto the couch. He was adrift in a sea of his own loneliness, and he had forgotten how to swim. And so, instinctively, he reached for the nearest solid thing in the water. He reached for me. The ritual began with movie nights. It was his suggestion, a way to fill the long, quiet evenings. At first, it was a perfectly platonic arrangement. We'd sit on opposite ends of the long gray sofa, a continent of cushions between us, our attention fixed on the screen. The space between us was a silent, unacknowledged treaty, a border we both respected. But after a week or two, the border began to erode. It started with him feigning exhaustion. Halfway through a film, he would sigh, a sound heavy with the weight of his day, and let his head fall sideways to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was suddenly aware of every point of contact, the surprisingly solid weight of his head, the warmth seeping through the fabric of my t-shirt, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I was certain he could feel it, that the vibration would give me away. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull back, to laugh and say he'd almost fallen asleep. But he did not. He just stayed there, his breathing evening out, and I forced myself to relax, muscle by painful muscle. I sat there for over an hour, a living statue, my arm going numb, terrified to move, to disturb this fragile, impossible peace. It was a sweet agony, a feeling so intensely yearned for that its arrival was almost unbearable. This became the new normal. Every movie night, at some point, his head would find my shoulder. It was a silent, implicit request for comfort, one I granted without a word. I became an expert in stillness, in the art of being a fixed point. My internal world, however, was a storm of analysis and fear. Was this just what friends did? Was he so starved for simple human contact that he was turning to me to fill the void Sarah had left? Or was it something more? I dissected every gesture, every sigh, every slight shift in his weight, searching for meaning, for a clue that would tell me if I was standing on solid ground or on a cliff's edge. It was exhausting. It was exquisite. Then came the blanket. One evening in late autumn, a chill had settled into the city. He came out of his room holding the thick, knitted throw we kept on the armchair. "It's freezing in here," he said, his teeth chattering in a slightly exaggerated way. Instead of just wrapping it around himself, he sat down next to me, closer than usual, and unfurled it over both of us, tucking it around my legs as well as his own. Under the tint of the blanket, a new geography was created. The neutral territory of the couch cushions disappeared. Now, our legs were pressed together from hip to ankle. I could feel the heat of his thigh against mine, the solidness of his calf. The boundary had not just been eroded, it had been erased. He settled in, picked up the remote, and pressed play, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. For him, perhaps it was. For me, it was a revolution. The air under the blanket grew warm and thick with our shared breath. I felt like I was drowning in proximity, my senses overwhelmed by the simple, undeniable fact of his body next to mine. The nights grew colder, and the blanket became a permanent fixture of our evenings. I grew accustomed to the feeling of his leg alongside mine, to the point where its absence would have felt like a loss. I learned to breathe in the small space we shared, to let the frantic bird in my chest settle into a steadier rhythm. But just as I was adjusting to this new level of intimacy, he redrew the map once more. The nightmares started about a month after the breakup. At least, that is what he called them. I would be woken in the dead of night by a sound from his room, a muffled cry, a sudden, violent thrashing that made the wall between our bedrooms shudder. The first time it happened, I bolted out of bed, my heart pounding with alarm, and ran to his door. I found him sitting up, tangled in his sheets, his face slick with sweat in the moonlight. "Alex, are you okay?" I whispered from the doorway. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and unfocused for a moment before they cleared. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bad dream. This happens several times a week." I would hear him cry out, and my own sleep would be shattered. I worried about him, about the toll the breakup and his job stress were taking. One night, after a particularly bad one, I was standing in his doorway, watching him try to steady his breathing, when he looked at me with a raw, pleading expression. "Jules," he said, his voice small. "This is going to sound stupid, but would you mind just leaving your door open tonight? Just knowing it's open. It might help, leaving my door open." It was such a small thing. A meaningless gesture, really. But in the silent language we were developing, it felt monumental. A door is a boundary, a statement of privacy, of separation. To leave it open was an invitation, a dismantling of the very architecture of our platonic separateness. It was an act of trust, of vulnerability. I felt a tremor of something that was equal parts hope and terror. "Of course," I said, my voice softer than I intended. And so the next ritual began. Every night, before I got into bed, I would leave my bedroom door ajar. And every night, he would leave his open as well. Our rooms were no longer sealed-off capsules. They were two interconnected spaces, a channel of darkness flowing between them. Lying in my bed, I could hear the small sounds of him settling in, the rustle of sheets, a soft cough, the faint click of his phone being placed on the nightstand. I could hear the rhythm of his breathing across the hall. It was an intimacy that was both profound and agonizing. He was closer than ever, and yet still a room away. The open door was a promise of access that was never fulfilled, a constant, silent reminder of the distance that remained. I would lie awake for hours, staring into the slice of dark hallway, listening, waiting for a sound I could not name. The culmination of this slow, inexorable march across boundaries came on a Thursday night. It had been a terrible week for him at work. A major project he was leading had hit a series of critical failures, and he had been working punishing hours, fueled by caffeine and stress. He came home looking utterly depleted, a ghost haunting the edges of his own skin. We skipped the movie, and he went to bed early. I lay in my own room, the door open as usual, and listened to him toss and turn. The sounds were more restless than usual, punctuated by heavy, frustrated sighs. Around 1 a.m, I heard the sharp, terrified cry that signaled another nightmare. This time, it sounded worse, more visceral. I waited. Usually, he would settle back down after a few minutes. But the silence that followed was different. It felt heavy, broken. Then I heard the soft padding of bare feet on the hardwood floor in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I saw his silhouette appear in the open doorway of my room, a tall, dark shape against the fainter darkness of the hall. He just stood there for a long moment, not speaking. "Alex," I whispered into the quiet. "I can't," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I can't go back to sleep in there. I can't be alone right now." He took a hesitant step into the room. Would it be weird if I just slept on your floor? I'll take a pillow. You won't even know I'm here." The image of him sleeping on my floor, curled up like a stray dog seeking shelter, was something I could not bear. It was too pitiful, too self-abnegating. Every instinct in me rose up to reject it. "Don't be an idiot," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I shifted over to one side of my queen-sized bed, pulling the duvet with me. "There's plenty of room. Just get in." The silence that followed my offer was charged with 1,000 unspoken implications. This was not the couch. This was not a shared blanket. This was a bed. My bed. It was the final, most sacred boundary. He stood in the doorway for another long moment, and I thought he was going to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of his own room. But then he moved. He walked slowly to the empty side of the bed and slid under the covers. He did it with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. He lay on his back, stiff as a board, his hands folded on his chest, staring up at the ceiling. I turned onto my side, facing away from him, my back a rigid wall. The space between us was a chasm, a few inches of mattress that felt like a mile-wide canyon. But it was also a live wire, humming with a dangerous and thrilling current. I was intensely, painfully aware of him. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could hear the impossibly loud sound of his breathing, just behind my shoulder. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay there, feigning slumber, my mind racing. I was cataloging every sensation. The slight dip his weight made in the mattress, the way the sheet shifted when he moved his leg, the faint, clean, familiar scent of him that now filled my pillows. This was the heart of the sweet agony. To have him so close, to have the one thing I wanted more than anything in the world, but to have it under a false pretense, a pretext of comfort and nightmares. It was a beautiful, exquisite torture. He did not leave in the morning. I woke from a light, fitful doze to find him still there, sleeping deeply now, his face relaxed in a way I had not seen in weeks. One of his arms was thrown out, his hand resting on the pillow near my head, his fingers just inches from my hair. I watched him breathe in the gray morning light, my chest tight with a feeling so vast and painful it felt like it might break me open. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every night, but on the bad nights, the nights he came home looking shattered, he would appear in my doorway, a silent, hopeful question in his posture. And I would move over, making room. We never spoke of it in the daylight. In the morning, we would get up and make coffee and talk about work or the weather, as if we had not just spent the night sharing the most intimate of spaces. It was a secret we kept from ourselves, a fragile truce with the truth, enacted only under the cover of darkness. And that brought us to this car, on this night, taking the long way home. The drive had been prompted by a celebratory dinner for a coworker of his. He had insisted I come along, saying he did not want to go alone. And I, as always, had agreed. The dinner was loud and cheerful, and Alex had played his part perfectly, laughing and telling stories, the charismatic, easygoing man everyone knew him to be. But I could see the strain around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand when he lifted his glass. He was performing, and it was costing him dearly. When we finally left, the moment the car doors closed, the mask fell away. He slumped in the passenger seat, his head leaning against the cool glass of the window, the exhaustion rolling off him in waves. "Thanks for coming tonight, Jules," he had said quietly. I wouldn't have made it through that alone, any time," I'd replied, and the word felt both true and wholly inadequate. And then, after a few minutes of silence, had come the request. He didn't want to ride home alone. A statement of fact, a confession of need that had become the foundation of our new dynamic. And then, the amendment. Could we take the long way? A request for more time in this bubble, this moving sanctuary where the rules of the outside world did not seem to apply. And as I drove, the sweep of the headlights cutting a path through the coastal darkness, I felt a sense of impending change. The rituals, the unspoken language, the carefully constructed pretenses, they had all been leading here. The slow, patient burn was about to reach its flashpoint. Something had to break. The pressure had become too great. We did not speak for the entire drive. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the crunch of tires on the occasional patch of gravel, and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean. It was a comfortable silence, but it was also a heavy one, freighted with the weight of everything we had not said for the past several months. When I finally pulled into our designated spot in the apartment complex parking lot, I switched off the engine. The sudden, absolute quiet was deafening. Neither of us moved to get out. We just sat there, in the dark, breathing. "We're home," I said, stating the obvious because the silence was too much to bear. Alex did not look at me. He continued to stare out the windshield at the darkened windows of our building. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Home." The word sounded strange on his lips, as if he were questioning its meaning. After another long moment, he finally turned his head and looked at me. His eyes, in the dim, ambient light, were dark pools of an emotion I could not decipher. It looked like fear, but also like something else. Something like resolve. We went inside, the familiar routine of our return playing out in slow motion. Kicking off shoes, dropping keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, shedding our jackets. The air in the apartment felt different tonight. Tense. Electric. Alex went straight to his room, and I went to mine. I thought, with a sinking feeling of disappointment, that tonight would be a retreat, that the tension had been too much, and he was withdrawing back behind his own walls. I got ready for bed, the motions automatic, my mind replaying the drive, the silence, the look in his eyes. I left my door open, more out of habit now than expectation. I had just settled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, when his silhouette appeared in the doorway. He did not have the posture of someone seeking refuge from a nightmare. He stood straight, his shoulders squared. He walked into the room and came to the side of the bed, just as he had so many times before. But this time, when he slid under the covers, he did not immediately turn his back. He lay on his side, facing me. We were inches apart, close enough that I could see the faint constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. The moonlight filtering through the window cast a silvery glow on his face, illuminating the conflict in his eyes. He was looking at me, really looking at me, in a way he never had before in this space. His gaze was direct, searching, and so intensely vulnerable that it stole the air from my lungs. The silence stretched, thin and taut, a thread that could snap at any moment. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth, the end of the beautiful, torturous ambiguity. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. He closed them, swallowed hard. Then he tried again, his voice a low, trembling whisper that was absorbed by the pillows between us. Julian. I could only manage a nod, my throat too tight for words. He held my gaze, his own eyes shining with a terrifying mixture of fear and desperate sincerity. He took a breath, a shuddering inhalation that seemed to draw in all the courage he possessed. Would it be weird if I kissed you? The world stopped. The frantic bird in my chest went still. The roaring in my ears fell silent. There was only his question, hanging in the small, sacred space between us. It was not a proposition. It was a plea, a confession, an admission that all the rituals, all the nights on the couch, all the shared blankets and open doors and borrowed space in my bed, they were not just about comfort. They were about this. They were about him, stumbling blindly through his own loneliness, following an instinct he did not understand, until he found himself here, in my bed, asking for the one thing he did not know he was searching for. And in that moment, all my own fear, all my carefully constructed walls, all my years of patient, silent yearning, they all dissolved into a single, overwhelming wave of tenderness for the man in front of me, for his confusion and his bravery. I shook my head slowly, the motion almost imperceptible. No. I breathed, the word a wisp of sound. Not weird, a universe of relief washed over his features. He closed his eyes for a second, as if in prayer, and then he leaned forward. The movement was agonizingly slow, tentative, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I did not move. I met him halfway, and then his lips were on mine. It was not a kiss of passion, of fire. It was a kiss of discovery. It was soft, hesitant, questioning. It tasted of salt and uncertainty and a deep, aching relief. It was a conversation we had been having for 5 years, finally spoken in a language we could both understand. It was the quiet, profound sound of a door, long sealed, finally clicking open. In that kiss, I felt the entire architecture of my world, which had been slowly pivoting for months, finally settle into a new and breathtaking alignment. The ghost in the walls of our friendship stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and I realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that he was not the only one who had been living in a closed room. The aftermath of a moment like that is never as clean as you imagine it will be. You expect the world to be remade, for the sun to rise on a landscape that is brighter, clearer, more defined. But the morning after that kiss, the world was simply quiet, and terribly, painfully awkward. I woke first, just as the dawn was beginning to bleed gray light into the room. Alex was still asleep, his head on the pillow next to mine, his arm now draped over my waist, his hand resting on my hip. The casual, possessive intimacy of the gesture sent a fresh wave of shock and wonder through me. I lay there for a long time, not moving, simply watching him sleep, trying to reconcile the man who had kissed me with the friend I had known for years. They were the same person, I knew, but the synthesis felt fragile, impossible. When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttered open and met mine. For a fleeting second, there was a look of soft, drowsy confusion, and then memory flooded in. I saw it happen. I saw the awareness of the night before dawn on his face, and it was immediately followed by a shadow of something I could only identify as panic. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and refused to look at me. The open, vulnerable man from the night before was gone, and in his place was a stranger, tense and guarded. I have an early call, he mumbled, not to me, but to the wall. He scrambled out of bed, grabbing his clothes from where he'd left them on the floor. He was a whirlwind of nervous energy, pulling on a shirt, avoiding my gaze as if it were a physical blow. Alex, I started, my voice still rough with sleep. We'll talk later. He cut me off, the words clipped and final. And then he was gone, retreating to his own room. A few minutes later, I heard his door close with a soft, definitive click. The sound undid me. For months, that sound had been absent, our open doors a symbol of our growing closeness. Now, it was back, a barrier erected between us, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. I heard the shower run, and then, not long after, the front door opened and closed. He had left without coffee, without another word. He had run. The silence he left behind was a suffocating thing. It was heavier than any of the silences we had shared before, because this one was not filled with unspoken yearning. It was filled with regret. His regret. I spent the day in a haze of misery. Every hopeful, beautiful feeling from the night before curdled into doubt and humiliation. I had misread everything. The kiss had not been a confession. It had been a mistake. A moment of weakness and loneliness on his part. A temporary lapse in judgment that he was now deeply regretting. I was not the destination he'd been searching for. I was just a convenient port in a storm. And now that the storm had passed, he was sailing away, leaving me wrecked on the shore. The ghost of my love, which had felt so real and solid in the moonlight, had become a ghost once more, and I felt like the biggest fool in the world. He did not come home that night. A text message appeared on my phone around 7 in the evening. Hey, crashing at a friend's place tonight. Project's a mess. Need to be closer to the office. A transparent, cowardly lie. He was not at a friend's place. He was anywhere but here. He was running from the conversation he had promised, from the mess he had created in my bed, in my heart. The next day was the same. And the day after that. The apartment, once a sanctuary of shared comfort, became a tomb. Every object, the gray sofa, the knitted blanket, the closed door to his bedroom, was a monument to my own stupidity. The hope that had bloomed in me was withering, turning to a bitter, protective anger. How dare he? How dare he use my affection as a temporary balm for his own loneliness and then discard it so carelessly? How dare he open that door inside me, only to slam it shut in my face? On the third day, I decided I could not live in the tomb any longer. I could not let him ghost me in our own home. My pain was hardening into resolve. I deserved an explanation. Not a text message, not an excuse, but the truth, face to face. Whatever his reasons, whatever his feelings, I needed to hear them. The ambiguity had once been a sweet torture. Now it was just torture. I texted him, my thumb surprisingly steady. We need to talk. Tonight. Come home, Alex. It was not a request. It was a demand. For a long time, there was no reply. I watched the 3 little dots appear and disappear for what felt like an hour. Then, finally, a single word. Okay. The hours leading up to his return were the longest of my life. I paced the apartment, a caged animal. I rehearsed what I would say, my arguments swinging wildly between furious accusation and wounded pleading. By the time I heard his key in the lock, I was emotionally exhausted, left with nothing but a quiet, hollow ache. He walked in, looking as tired and haunted as I felt. He did not take off his jacket. He just stood in the entryway, a guest in his own home. "Hi," he said, his voice low. "Don't," I said, my own voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Don't pretend this is normal." I walked to the living room and sat on the couch, my end of the couch, and waited. He followed, but he did not sit. He stood by the armchair, rubbing the back of his neck, a familiar nervous gesture. "What happened, Alex?" I asked, looking at him directly, forcing him to meet my eyes. "What was that?" "The kiss. And then this. The running away. Just tell me the truth. Was it a mistake? Were you just lonely? Just tell me. So I can move on." He flinched at the word mistake. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery that mirrored my own. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "It wasn't a mistake. Then what was it?" I pressed, my voice rising despite myself. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you kissed your lonely, gay best friend because you were sad, and then you woke up and realized what you'd done, and you've been running from it ever since. So please, enlighten me." The accusation, raw and ugly, hung in the air between us. He sank into the armchair as if his legs could no longer support him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Jules," he whispered into his palms. "I'm so sorry for how I handled this. I'm an idiot. I'm a coward." He looked up, his face a mess of shame and confusion. "I wasn't running from you. I swear. I was running from myself." He took a deep, shuddering breath. When Sarah left, what she said about me being a closed room, it hit me hard, because I knew it was true. I've spent my whole life being this easy, happy guy. It's what everyone expects. It's what I expected of myself. And when I was with her, or any of the others, I was playing a part. I cared about them, but there was always a wall. I never let them in. "Not really." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And then, after she left, I was so lost, so lonely, and I started leaning on you. And it was different. The comfort I felt, sitting next to you on this couch, having you in the same house, it was a different kind of quiet. It was a quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt full. It felt like home, in a way that my own room, my own head, never did." He gestured vaguely around the room. "All of it, my head on your shoulder, the blanket, the open doors. I wasn't thinking. I was just following a feeling. I was just moving toward the one thing in my life that felt real, that felt safe. I was moving toward you." His confession was a balm on my raw, wounded heart. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. That night, in the car, I didn't want to go home because I knew that if we went back to our separate rooms, this thing I was feeling would just get locked away again. And then in your bed, looking at you, I knew. I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. It wasn't just about comfort. It wasn't about friendship. It was more. And it terrified me, because I have never, not once in my life, felt that for a man. And I didn't know what it meant. What it made me. "So you ran." I finished for him, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a profound, aching sympathy. "I ran," he confirmed, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I woke up, and I saw you, and everything felt so real and so right, and my brain just short-circuited. All the labels, all the expectations, everything I thought I knew about myself, it all came crashing down. And I panicked. I thought I was going to ruin everything. Our friendship, your life. I had to get out. I had to think. But I couldn't think. I just felt lost and miserable, because the one place I wanted to be was here, with you, and that was the one place I was too scared to be." He finally stood up and crossed the space between us. He knelt on the floor in front of me, his hands on his knees, looking up at me like a penitent. "I'm not confused anymore, Jules," he said, his voice low and certain. "These last 3 days without you have been the worst of my life. I don't know what this is exactly. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. All I know is that kissing you felt more like coming home than anything I have ever done. And I don't want to run from that anymore." The honesty in his eyes was absolute. All the doubt, all the hurt, all the fear I had been carrying for 3 days, it all washed away, leaving behind the clean, simple truth. He had been just as scared as I was. We had both been standing on the edge of a cliff, and when he had finally jumped, the shock of the fall had sent him scrambling back. But he had come back to the edge. He had come back for me. I reached out and placed my hand on the side of his face, my thumb stroking his cheek. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing, a long, shaky breath escaping him. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, Alex." The resolution did not come in a rush of triumphant music or a grand, cinematic embrace. It arrived quietly, in the gentle unfolding of the hours that followed. We talked for a long time, sitting on the couch, the space between us now a bridge instead of a chasm. I told him about my years of hidden feelings, about the photographs, about the sweet agony of his platonic touch. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and regret. He told me about the hollow feeling he'd always had, the sense of performing a life instead of living one, and how that feeling had always faded when he was with me. We were two people who had been speaking different languages, finally finding a common tongue. We were mapping out the new country we had just discovered together. That night, when we went to bed, there was no pretext. There were no nightmares, no requests for comfort. He simply took my hand, led me into my bedroom, and we lay down together, facing each other in the soft moonlight. He reached out and pulled me closer until my head was resting on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around me. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, a rhythm that was both new and impossibly familiar. It was the rhythm of peace, of safety, of finally being home. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered into my hair. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he was telling the truth. The days that followed were a process of gentle rediscovery. We were learning how to be us, in this new configuration. It was in the small things. It was in the way he would now reach for my hand while we were watching a movie, his fingers lacing through mine without hesitation. It was in the mornings, making coffee together in the kitchen, his arms circling my waist from behind as I waited for the kettle to boil. It was in the way I could now take his picture, not as a secret, stolen act of devotion, but as an open expression of it, and he would smile for the camera, his eyes full of a light that was meant only for me. His bedroom door remained closed, not as a barrier, but because his room was now empty. He had, piece by piece, moved his life into mine. His clothes found space in my closet, his books appeared on my shelves. Our two separate territories had merged into one. One Saturday afternoon, I was developing photos in the small darkroom I had set up in our second bathroom. The red safe light cast a warm, uterine glow over everything. Alex came in and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my chest, his chin resting on my shoulder. We watched together as an image slowly emerged in the tray of developer. It was a photo I had taken of him a few days before, sitting at the kitchen table, bathed in the early morning light, a coffee mug in his hands, a soft, unguarded smile on his face. It was the best picture I had ever taken of him. "You see me," he said quietly, his voice full of a gentle wonder as he watched his own image appear. "You always have, haven't you?" "Always," I confirmed, leaning my head back against his shoulder. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The closed rooms inside of him began to open, one by one. He talked about his fears, his family, the pressures he felt to be a certain kind of man. And I, in turn, learned to dismantle my own walls, to let him see the vulnerable, hopeful man who had been hiding behind the lens for so long. The long way home had not been a detour. It had been the path itself. It was a journey that had started years ago, on the chlorinated deck of a university pool, and had wound its way through shared apartments and late-night conversations, through heartbreak and loneliness, through unspoken rituals and terrifying confessions. It was a journey that had led us, finally, here, to this quiet, sunlit room, to this simple, profound peace, to a home we had not realized we were building, together,